Welcome to Velvet Murmurs, where every whisper hides a secret. I'm so glad you've joined us for today's mystery. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. We love hearing from mystery lovers all around the world. Miss Marple and the Hatpin Mystery. Chapter 1. The Village Fete at Marbledown Green. It was the sort of day that made the English countryside feel eternal. Sunshine filtered through pale clouds, the scent of damp grass beneath canvas tents, and the sound of a brass band slightly off-key in the distance. Marbledown Green was dressed for its annual summer fete, and the entire village had turned out for the occasion. There were jam stalls, of course, a competition for the best gooseberry preserve. There was a dog show run by the vicar's enthusiastic young wife. Children raced with spoons and eggs, older ladies sold embroidery, and in the centre of it all stood the old maypole, newly painted for the day. Miss Marple sat primly under the shade of a hawthorn tree near the tea tent, a wide-brimmed straw hat pinned at a jaunty angle with a simple pearl-headed pin. She held a cup of strong tea in gloved hands and observed the world before her with the kind of quiet focus that saw rather more than most would like. She had not meant to attend the fete at all. Her visit to Marbledown was a last-minute affair, prompted by a letter from an old friend, Mrs. Beatrice Langton, now the widow of Colonel Langton, and recently settled in a small cottage on the edge of the green. Beatrice had written, "Do come for the fete. It's a little thing, but there's something rather peculiar in the air lately. I can't quite put my finger on it." Peculiar indeed, thought Miss Marple. Though nothing overtly criminal, there was a hum beneath the village's pleasant chatter, a slight edge in some greetings, the tightening of lips as two women passed one another, and whispers that fell silent when others drew close. As the band struck up Greensleeves, Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the costumed procession gathering near the Rose Arch. This year, in a fit of whimsy, the fete had taken a 1920s theme. The women wore cloche hats, strings of imitation pearls, and long gloves. The men appeared in waistcoats and fedoras. It was all rather charming, though Miss Marple, who had actually lived through the 1920s, found the nostalgia somewhat misplaced. A young woman in emerald green flounced past, the feather on her headband nearly catching on Miss Marple's parasol. She giggled, flanked by two men dressed as flappers for comedic effect. Further behind came a more elegant figure, tall, blonde, and striking. She wore a pale lilac dress with beading at the hem and a silver hatpin holding her artfully tilted hat in place. "That," whispered Beatrice Langton, suddenly appearing at Miss Marple's side with a plate of Battenberg cake, "is Verity Huntley. She's only just moved to the village. Apparently, she's something of a society widow." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "Very graceful." Beatrice gave a small snort. "And very admired, though not universally welcomed. The Colonel's daughter, Emma Crowell, is said to be furious about something Verity said at the Women's Guild." "And what was that?" "Oh, something about the past not being as pure as it likes to pretend. You know Emma, always parading her father's medals and family name." Miss Marple turned her attention to the woman in question. Emma Crowell, stout and sharp-nosed, stood near the sponge cakes, arms crossed, watching Verity with narrowed eyes. Miss Marple sipped her tea. "It's always interesting, Beatrice, how quickly a village fete can turn into a theatre of long-standing grievances." Beatrice chuckled. "You always say that, because it's always true." As the contest for Best Period Costume was announced, a cluster of participants moved toward the judging tent. Among them was Verity Huntley, her gloved hand resting lightly on the arm of a gentleman in a Panama hat, Mr. Julian Wade, the local solicitor, widowed and considered a catch by some of the more forward-thinking ladies in the village. Another figure stood alone, Mrs. Edna Draycott, the churchwarden's wife, tall and unsmiling, dressed in morning black despite the theme. Miss Marple had noticed her lingering near Verity's table earlier in the day, pretending to browse books but clearly listening. "There's history between them, I think," said Beatrice, following Miss Marple's gaze. "Isn't there always?" said Miss Marple softly. Just then a scream rang out from the coat-room tent, sharp, piercing, and unmistakably real. The band stopped mid-note. People turned as a young girl ran out, white-faced, shouting, "There's someone on the floor! She's not moving!" Beatrice clutched her chest. "Good heavens!" Miss Marple was already on her feet, setting her teacup aside and walking with deliberate calm toward the source of the noise. Inside the canvas tent, between racks of vintage coats and hats, a figure lay crumpled on the matting floor. Her dress was lilac, her head lay at an unnatural angle, her hat had fallen off, revealing a carefully waved blonde bob. A silver hatpin protruded from her chest, driven directly into the heart. Verity Huntley was dead. Miss Marple knelt slightly beside the body and observed without touching. The pin was long, old-fashioned and ornate, not quite like the one Verity had been wearing earlier. Miss Marple's sharp eyes darted across the small space. One coat had fallen from its hook. A fur wrap lay discarded near the entrance. A single scuff of mud marred the corner of the mat. Someone had come in here with purpose and killed with precision. A crowd was forming, the vicar shouting for calm and the local constable arriving breathless. Miss Marple straightened, her expression unreadable. Beatrice touched her arm. Was it an accident?" Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "No, Beatrice, that was not an accident, that was murder." Chapter 2. Whispers and Warnings. The coat-room tent had been cordoned off with borrowed bunting and 2 hay bales, the latter hastily dragged by a red-faced constable who looked as though he'd far rather be judging the scones. Villagers milled about the green in clusters, speaking in hushed voices and darting glances toward the scene of the crime, their cheerful costumes now strangely out of place. Verity Huntley's body had been respectfully covered with a picnic rug, and a doctor from the next village was on his way. Until then, it was agreed that nothing inside the tent should be disturbed. Miss Marple stood quietly near the judging marquee, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She was not one to insert herself. She simply waited, and in time, people came to her. "Oh, dreadful business," muttered Mrs. Grace Pottle, who ran the embroidery stall and had been known to eavesdrop more efficiently than any telephone exchange. "I said to Muriel this morning, didn't I? I said that woman had a look about her. Something too polished." "Polished?" Miss Marple repeated, her tone lightly curious. "Those types," said Mrs. Pottle with a sniff. "They're used to being watched. I've seen it before, at seaside boarding houses. They always hold something back." Miss Marple inclined her head politely. "Were you acquainted with Miss Huntley?" "Only to nod at. She never joined the committee, you know. Bit above it all." Nearby, the vicar was attempting to restore order with a gentle hand, while the constable, young Jack Hayward, barely out of school, did his best to shoo people back from the tent's edges. He looked rather overwhelmed, and when he noticed Miss Marple watching him, he blushed. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat, "didn't expect to see you here today." "I find village fetes quite revealing," she replied, "and very informative." The young constable shifted uncomfortably. "We'll have the real police from Chilcombe over soon. Until then, I've been told to maintain the scene." "A difficult task," Miss Marple said kindly, noting the crowd still buzzing near the cake stall. "You're doing very well." She left him encouraged and walked slowly toward the tea tent, where the committee had gathered with tight lips and overly full teacups. Beatrice Langton sat among them, pale but composed, and motioned her over. It's all anyone's talking about, Beatrice whispered, though you wouldn't think so from the silence here. Indeed, the mood in the tent was hushed, not from grief, but caution. Emma Crowell sat stiffly in a folding chair, hat perched at a disapproving angle. To her right was Mrs. Edna Draycott, still dressed entirely in black, her gloved hands wrapped tightly around her teacup. "We'll need to postpone the judging," Emma said coldly. "The fête must still be managed properly. That's our duty to the village." "No one is judging cakes, Emma," said Mrs. Langton gently. Emma's nostrils flared. "Let's not fall apart." Mrs. Draycott cleared her throat. "Does anyone know who found her?" The question hung in the air. Miss Marple listened without comment. "It was Maggie Pierce, the baker's daughter," someone replied quietly. "Went in to fetch her shawl." There was a brief pause. Then Mrs. Draycott said, "It wasn't her shawl." The room turned. "She said it was her shawl," someone murmured. "It wasn't," Draycott said firmly. "It belonged to Miss Huntley. I saw her wearing it earlier when she was speaking to Mr. Wade." Miss Marple looked down at her gloves as if lost in thought. Julian Wade, the local solicitor, had indeed been escorting Verity Huntley earlier that afternoon. She had seen it herself, a gentleman's gallant gesture, nothing more. And yet, gestures, like gloves, sometimes concealed more than they revealed. She turned slightly and peered across the green. Wade now stood near the bookstall, engaged in tense conversation with a short, round man in a pale trilby. The latter was Mr. Harold Timms, the newspaper publisher from over in Chilcombe, a man known for enjoying scandal almost as much as selling print. "Do you know what I find curious?" said Beatrice suddenly, voice low. No one seems very surprised, not shocked, not even upset, just waiting. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "That is curious." They watched as Reverend Quill, the vicar, approached Mr. Wade and spoke to him with a frown. Mr. Wade listened, lips pressed in a thin line. He nodded stiffly, said something in return, and walked away toward the far path leading to the church gate. Mrs. Draycott's eyes followed him. "She always did enjoy attention," she murmured. "The kind that leads to trouble." Emma Crowell scoffed. "Attention? Please, she enjoyed money. And the men who had it." Miss Marple looked up mildly. "You seem quite certain." Emma turned to her sharply. "We all saw it. She paraded about as though this village was some Riviera hotel, smiling at every man, ignoring the rest of us." "Had she been here long?" 3 months, just long enough to collect admirers." Mrs. Draycott gave a faint cough. "She was not without grief, Emma. Her husband's death was barely a year ago, and I believe she had a child once. Lost it, I think." Miss Marple's eyes lifted slightly. "Lost it, I think." Such phrases, she knew, were often carefully chosen, somewhere between fact and memory. Just then a new figure entered the tent, Mr. Alfred Payne, the village doctor. He removed his cap and cleared his throat. "I've just seen to the body," he said quietly. "It was quite swift. Puncture wound to the chest, likely the heart. I'd prefer to wait for the coroner from Chilcombe before I say more." Miss Marple spoke for the first time in several minutes. "Did you happen to notice what was used?" The doctor looked her way. "An old-fashioned hatpin, quite sharp, rather longer than modern ones, deliberate." "Strange choice for a weapon," Emma said. Miss Marple gave her a look that was almost indulgent. "Yes, unless one had it already in hand." A silence followed, and the flutter of bunting outside sounded suddenly loud. Dr. Payne shifted. "I'll be writing a statement for Constable Hayward, but if any of you saw or heard anything unusual—" He trailed off. No one replied. Miss Marple looked again out of the tent flap toward the green. The sun was already beginning to droop behind the sycamores, casting long shadows across the grass. Children's laughter, once loud, had faded to a low hum, and most villagers had begun to slip away. The air not heavy with grief, but with something quieter, warier. The fête was over, and so, she thought, was someone's game. Chapter 3. The Lady with the Grey Gloves. The next morning broke over Marbledown Green with the kind of soft, uncertain light that seemed to hesitate before brightening. There had been no rain, yet the hedgerows dripped with dew, and the bunting, still hanging from the maypole, fluttered as if embarrassed by the previous day's excitement. At the vicarage, a kettle began to boil. Outside the bakery, the scent of fresh bread offered small comfort. But the air in the village remained heavy, not with grief, but with waiting. Miss Marple sat beside the mullioned window in Mrs. Langton's drawing room, her knitting untouched in her lap. She was not a woman who rushed her conclusions. Instead, she let people move, speak, and contradict themselves, as they always did. "Beatrice," she said at last, "did you ever see Miss Huntley walk alone in the mornings?" Mrs. Langton, seated across with a lukewarm cup of tea, blinked. "Well, no. Come to think of it, she often stayed indoors until late morning. Why?" Miss Marple didn't answer at once. She recalled something from the fête, a moment as Verity adjusted her shawl, glancing toward the church path. A flicker of worry, or perhaps recognition. Not a dramatic reaction, no gasp or startle, just the quiet tension of someone spotting an unwelcome face. People rarely lie outright, Miss Marple thought, but they often conceal their feelings behind the most ordinary gestures. She stood, slipping on her coat and hat. "I believe I'll take a walk through the village." The village was subdued. Market stalls were already being dismantled near the post office. The florist was arranging a pale bouquet in the window, lilies and baby's breath, while the newspaper stand displayed an early headline: "Murder at Village Fête, Hatpin used in killing." Outside the vicarage gate stood Maggie Pierce, the baker's daughter, who had discovered the body. She was pale and fidgeting with her apron hem. Miss Marple paused. "Such a sad business, my dear." Maggie looked up quickly. "Yes, ma'am." "You knew Miss Huntley, didn't you?" "Not much. Only to say good morning. She was very elegant." "She was indeed. And was she always so generous with her shawls?" Maggie's eyes widened. "Oh, you mean—" "Yes, I had it for a while, didn't I? I found it just before I went in for mine, hanging on the peg. I thought someone had left it by mistake, so I wrapped it round myself. Just for a moment. I was cold. And then I saw it had perfume on it. Something spicy, not like usual. And I thought perhaps it wasn't mine after all. So I went back to the tent and, well, yes, said Miss Marple gently. No need to relive it. Thank you, dear." She left the girl with a kind smile and walked on. The perfume. Spicy. Not floral, not powdery. Possibly foreign. Miss Marple remembered that particular scent. She had smelled it once before. In Cairo, she thought, many years ago, but that was hardly relevant. Or was it? By mid-morning, Miss Marple found herself near the church, its stone walls cool and quiet. She did not go inside, but circled the rear path where the graveyard sloped down to a thicket of apple trees. There, leaning against the low wall, stood a woman in grey gloves and a dark cape. She turned as Miss Marple approached. "Mrs. Draycott," Miss Marple said, smiling gently. "Miss Marple," the woman replied. Her voice was always calm, too calm, as though her words had been ironed before speaking. "I come here often. It's peaceful." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "Such places have a way of revealing the truth, don't they?" Mrs. Draycott's brow tightened. "You believe there is a truth that needs revealing?" "Oh, my dear," said Miss Marple, looking toward the graves. "There is always something that needs revealing, especially in a small village." Mrs. Draycott looked down. "People speak too freely, they always have." Miss Marple said nothing. She was not here for confessions, not yet. Instead, she changed the subject entirely. "I heard Miss Huntley once lost a child." The woman's face twitched, barely. "That was only village talk." "Talk," Miss Marple murmured, "is often rooted in something, truth or envy, sometimes both." They stood together in silence a moment longer. Then Miss Marple turned to go. As she walked back toward the lane, she glanced once over her shoulder. Mrs. Draycott was still there, but her grey-gloved hands had come up to her face, covering her mouth. By afternoon, news had spread that Mr. Julian Wade, the solicitor, had postponed a business trip to London. A discreet clerk from his office had mentioned this fact over sausages at the butcher's. Word travelled fast in Marbledown. Miss Marple encountered him near the apothecary, a slim briefcase tucked under one arm. He looked tired, but not unkind. "Miss Marple," he said courteously, "do forgive the lack of cheer, a difficult time." "Indeed, Miss Huntley was a friend." "Of sorts?" "A recent acquaintance. She was—" He hesitated. "Interesting. She made people uncomfortable, I think, though she never meant to." "Meaning often has very little to do with how people are received," Miss Marple said mildly. "Did you know her well?" He smiled thinly. "No one did." And with that, he tipped his hat and continued on. That evening, as the sun cast amber light over the garden, Miss Marple returned to the cottage. Beatrice was making tea, humming faintly. "Any new observations?" Beatrice asked, with a half-smile. Miss Marple settled into her chair. "Only that everyone claims to know very little about Miss Huntley, and yet speaks of her with strong feelings." Beatrice handed over a fresh cup of tea. "What does that tell you?" Miss Marple gave a soft chuckle. "It tells me, dear, that someone's lying, just not about the murder." "Not yet." She sipped her tea slowly. "It's always the quiet details. A borrowed shawl, grey gloves, a scent that doesn't belong. These are the things that tell the truth in the end." And with that, she picked up her knitting once more, her needles clicking gently in the calm before the storm. Chapter 4. Ink and Interruption. Rain drifted gently across Marbledown that afternoon, not in any meaningful downpour, but in soft, drifting sheets that hung in the air like mist. The fête stalls were being dismantled properly now, and even the bunting had been taken down, leaving the village green bare and oddly exposed. The laughter of the previous day was a distant echo. Inside the village hall, chairs were stacked, decorations boxed, and an unpleasant silence hung between the committee members, tasked with tidying up what had become a scene of scandal. Miss Marple, however, was not there. She had taken a quiet stroll toward the church, her purpose simple and unassuming, to return a borrowed umbrella. But she was not one for straight paths. Her feet carried her through the rear vestry gate, down the moss-lined path to the church office, a small, seldom-used room beside the vicarage. It was here, as she passed the window, that she heard voices. Low, hurried. She did not pause long, but long enough to catch two distinct tones. "Oh, it was in her hands, Julian. I saw it. She was trying to decide whether to send it." "I told you she wouldn't dare." "Not yet." Miss Marple continued walking without altering pace. She did not need names. Julian Wade and the vicar, Reverend Quill, had voices as recognizable as organ chords. What interested her more was the phrase, trying to decide whether to send it. A letter, likely unsent, and in Verity Huntley's hands. Miss Marple did not jump to conclusions. She never had. But she remembered something else now. A small stack of unposted letters at the post office on Saturday morning. The postmistress had been complaining of a broken scale and had delayed posting everything until Monday. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves. She would visit the post office shortly. The doorbell at Mrs. Langton's cottage rang mid-afternoon. Beatrice answered it and returned looking puzzled. "Emma Crowell," she said, "is in the parlour, says she'd like to apologise." "Apologise?" Miss Marple's brows rose slightly. "For her manner, apparently," said Beatrice. "She brought shortbread. She's never brought me anything but trouble." Miss Marple smiled and entered the parlour, where Emma Crowell, always pinched and proud, sat upright, gloved hands folded over her handbag. "I won't stay long," Emma said stiffly. "I simply wanted to clear the air. I may have spoken sharply yesterday." "Grief often sharpens the tongue," said Miss Marple. Emma blinked. "Well, yes, though I don't suppose I was grieving. Not exactly. It's just that—" She stopped, then resumed in a different tone. "Miss Huntley wasn't liked, but she didn't deserve that." "Few do," Miss Marple said quietly. Emma's fingers twitched. "I didn't know her well, but I did see her sometimes near the church, and I thought once or twice that she was crying, but she never said a word about it." "Did you speak with her often?" "Hardly at all. She mostly kept to herself. Well, except with Mr. Wade." Emma's tone flattened. "He was quite attentive." Miss Marple nodded gently. "I'm told she also knew Mrs. Draycott." Emma's expression shifted, just slightly. "Edna?" "Perhaps. They were seen talking, but you know Edna. She doesn't gossip, but she listens very well." "She does." There was a pause. "She once told me," Emma said suddenly, "that women like Verity always leave trouble behind them." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Women like Verity?" Emma opened her mouth, then shook her head. "No, never mind. Just words. I shouldn't have come. Do excuse me." She left without eating a single piece of shortbread. Miss Marple sat alone for a moment, watching the crumbs on the plate. Later, at the post office, Miss Marple stepped carefully through the door just before closing time. The postmistress, Mrs. Hanning, looked up with the tired smile of one who had spent a day avoiding questions. "Oh, Miss Marple, you're lucky. I was just about to lock up." "I won't take long," said Miss Marple. "Just needed to send a card to my niece. Is the outgoing mail still in the tray?" "It is," Mrs. Hanning said. "Bit of a backlog, you know. Machine trouble. I was about to sort through now." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the tray. Neatly stacked envelopes, most small, but one stood out. A pale blue envelope, fine paper, the corner slightly bent. And on the back, in careful handwriting, Miss G. Moore, Fieldstone Lodge, Isle of Wight. "Lovely paper," Miss Marple said, as if idly commenting. "Yes," Mrs. Hanning said. "That one came in just yesterday afternoon. Odd thing, too, no stamp on it, so I nearly discarded it. But then I thought perhaps someone had dropped it into the wrong tray. Do you recall who brought it?" Mrs. Hanning hesitated. "Well, I can't be sure, but I remember Miss Huntley coming in just after lunch. She looked pale, said she wasn't feeling well. Might have been her." Miss Marple smiled warmly. "You have a good memory." The postmistress beamed. That evening, Miss Marple sat again by the fire in Mrs. Langton's parlour. Her knitting was beside her, untouched. She was thinking. A letter, written and never posted properly. Possibly placed in the tray by mistake, or in a rush. Addressed to someone on the Isle of Wight, the name G. Moore meant nothing to her. Yet. Across the village, people were locking doors early, drawing curtains against the weather. Dr. Payne's dog barked twice. Someone coughed in the lane. And somewhere, Miss Marple thought, a person was waiting to see if the wrong truth would come to light. Not yet, not fully, but soon. Chapter 5. The Visitor from Chilcombe. The rain had lifted by morning, leaving the village hedgerows glistening and the roads slick with light mud. The usual routines had returned. The milk cart rolled down the lane, a pair of schoolboys kicked a damp football past the church gate, and the distant bell at the blacksmith's rang faintly with every passing hour. But within the heart of Marbledown, conversation had not moved on. The death of Verity Huntley lingered, not loud and dramatic, but like smoke in closed curtains. People spoke of it only when they thought they were alone. At Mrs. Langton's cottage, Miss Marple sat reading a slim volume of poetry she had borrowed from the vicar's library. She was not really reading, of course. Her eyes moved, but her mind was on something else entirely. The blue envelope, still resting, she assumed, in the postmistress's metal tray addressed to someone unknown on the Isle of Wight. The name, G. Moore, tugged at something. Not familiarity exactly, but the faint echo of an overheard comment or a page once turned. She was still pondering this when Beatrice appeared in the doorway, flushed and a little out of breath. "There's a man just arrived," she said, "from Chilcombe. Says he's here to see the constable, and you, if you're willing." "Did he give a name?" "He did, Mr. Thomas Moore." Miss Marple set her book aside gently. Moore. Mr. Thomas Moore stood tall and thin in the Langtons' parlour, hat in hand, shoes still damp with road dust. He had the manner of someone who once worked in an office, but had long since retreated from public life, his hair greying at the temples, his coat neat, but frayed at the cuffs. "I apologize for the intrusion," he said, his voice formal. "But I believe I may be connected to the recent tragedy here, in a roundabout way." Miss Marple motioned to the chair. "Please, go on." Mr. Moore sat slowly. "I read the paper yesterday morning. I wouldn't have come otherwise. But the article mentioned a woman named Verity Huntley, and that name, I recognized it." Miss Marple listened carefully. "My mother's name," Moore continued, "was Genevieve Moore. She passed away some years ago, but during her youth, in the late 1930s, she worked in service. She kept journals. I only read them after her death." Miss Marple's eyes rested softly on his face. "She mentioned a girl she once looked after," he said, "in London. A child born from scandal. The family hushed it up. The child was sent abroad, then brought back under a new name. Verity, she said. Verity Huntley. I thought it might be nonsense, you know. Memories blurred. But now—" Miss Marple stirred, only slightly. "And what prompted you to visit today?" "Well," said Mr. Moore, looking slightly embarrassed, "I received a letter, a short one, from someone named V. Huntley. It arrived 2 days ago." Miss Marple leaned forward, hands still folded. "Would you mind showing me?" Mr. Moore drew a thin envelope from his coat pocket. The paper was the same pale blue as the one Miss Marple had seen in the post tray. "Mr. Moore, you do not know me, but I believe you may know of someone who once helped my mother. There are things I wish to understand about where I came from and who was involved. I believe the answers lie here in Marbledown. If I don't write again, I trust you will forgive the intrusion. V.H. Miss Marple read it slowly. No threats, no accusations, just a simple plea for clarity. She returned the letter with care. "Did you respond?" "I tried, but there was no return address, just the Chilcombe postmark." Miss Marple gave a small, thoughtful nod. "And do you know anyone in this village?" "No one." "Have you mentioned this to the police?" "I wasn't sure if I should. Do you think I ought to?" Miss Marple considered this. "Not yet," she said gently. "You've done the right thing, Mr. Moore, but sometimes too much noise too early disturbs the waters we wish to see through." He smiled faintly. "You sound like my mother." "I shall take that as a compliment." That afternoon, Miss Marple took a quiet walk toward the outer lane of the village, where a string of older cottages backed onto the woods. She passed the church, the schoolhouse, and eventually found herself outside a modest home with lace curtains and polished windows, Mrs. Edna Draycott's cottage. She had not intended to call, but something had brought her there. Perhaps the grey gloves, perhaps the way Mrs. Draycott had stood at the graveside without blinking, yet had trembled ever so slightly when the name of a child was mentioned. Miss Marple knocked. The door opened, and Mrs. Draycott appeared with a faint smile, as if she had expected the visit. "Miss Marple," she said, "do come in." They sat in the parlour. The room was immaculate, every book aligned, every cushion plumped. A photograph of a young soldier, smiling, handsome, stood on the mantelpiece. "My son," Mrs. Draycott said, "died in the war, Burma." "I'm sorry," said Miss Marple quietly. Mrs. Draycott poured tea with steady hands. "I suppose people have been talking," she said. "They always do." Miss Marple didn't answer. "I knew Miss Huntley, yes, not closely, but well enough to see that she was troubled." Miss Marple stirred her tea. Troubled in what way? She had the look of someone who'd been betrayed, but never spoken of it, the kind of wound that heals only on the outside. Miss Marple nodded. "I tried once to ask if she needed help," Mrs. Draycott continued. "She said no, but she thanked me." "Kindness sometimes frightens people more than cruelty," Miss Marple said. A long pause followed. "I suppose she reminded me of someone," Edna Draycott said finally. "Someone I couldn't help, long ago." And that, Miss Marple thought, was the most honest thing she had said. As Miss Marple walked back through the village, the light fading behind the hill, she noted the soft rattle of a bicycle on the path. Constable Hayward was returning from Chilcombe, looking tired and slightly flustered. He paused as he saw her. "Miss Marple," he said, "we've had a telegram from the Isle of Wight. A woman named G. Moore passed away last year. No other relatives known." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Thank you, Jack." She turned back toward the green, hands tucked into her sleeves. If G. Moore was dead, then Verity Huntley's letter, the one meant for her, was never going to be read. Unless it had already been read by someone else. Chapter 6. A Name Etched in Silver. The next morning broke cold and still, as though the entire village held its breath. The sun did not rise boldly, but crept behind cloud cover, casting a pale light over Marbledown's rooftops. Everything seemed quieter than usual. Even the birdsong was tentative, as if uncertain how to behave in the wake of murder. Miss Marple was already up. She had slept little, her mind occupied not with speculation, but with patterns. Not facts, but behavior. She believed in observation more than deduction. People always revealed themselves eventually, in pauses, glances, in the objects they touched, and the ones they avoided. She left Beatrice's cottage just after breakfast and walked, not toward the centre of the village, but away from it, past the row of allotments and toward the wood-fringed edge of the old rectory. Her path was deliberate. For the past 3 mornings, she had seen Mrs. Draycott walk this way just after 9, not to attend to errands, not to visit neighbours, simply to disappear behind the yew trees for 20 or so minutes, then return quietly by another route. Today, Miss Marple followed. She moved slowly, not hiding, merely pausing when needed. The trees grew thicker near the back of the rectory grounds, where old family graves and forgotten footpaths curved into bramble. And there, just as she'd expected, stood Mrs. Draycott, alone. She was facing an old iron bench overgrown with ivy. In front of it, a small silver plaque gleamed on a low stone. Miss Marple stood back, just within earshot. She heard no words, only the soft sound of breathing. And something else, the tap of a hand against the plaque. Slow, rhythmic, like someone remembering. After a few minutes, Mrs. Draycott turned and began walking back. Miss Marple did not approach. She stepped forward only when the path was empty. The plaque was simple, for L.H., who was never named aloud but never forgotten. Miss Marple stood silently, her expression unreadable. Then she walked on. Later that day, the vicar invited Miss Marple for tea in his garden. Reverend Quill was a nervous man, prone to rearranging his sugar bowl and adjusting his spectacles every time the conversation grew uncomfortable, which it quickly did. "I do worry," he said, pouring her tea, "that the village is sliding toward hysteria. I've had calls from Chilcombe. Even the bishop sent a telegram. The suggestion of scandal is one thing, but a woman murdered with a hatpin?" He shook his head. "It sounds like a dreadful paperback." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Fiction often borrows from life, Reverend. The difference is, in fiction we usually get a clear reason." He coloured slightly. "Of course, I only meant... Well, I hardly knew Miss Huntley. She didn't attend church." "She came alone sometimes," Miss Marple said, "and sat at the back. You never noticed her?" Reverend Quill looked surprised. "I did see someone once. I thought it was Mrs. Langton, perhaps. I never approached." "Most people don't notice what they're not looking for," said Miss Marple gently. She let that thought linger before adding, "You mentioned the other day that Mr. Wade and Miss Huntley had exchanged letters." The vicar stirred uneasily. "Yes. Well, I can't say for certain. I know Julian visited her cottage once or twice. They had some professional discussion, something about paperwork. He told me he was helping her with a name change." Miss Marple blinked. "A name change?" Yes, that's what he said. Some legal thing. Perhaps she wanted to restore her maiden name, or remove it. I don't recall exactly." Miss Marple thanked him for the tea. That evening, she made her way toward Verity Huntley's cottage. It had been locked since the investigation began, with Constable Hayward holding the key. But the young man, trusting her judgment, and likely recalling her role in the unpleasantness at Nethercombe the year before, had quietly agreed to let her inside, provided she disturbed nothing. The cottage was neat, quiet, filled with the faint scent of old perfume and lavender. The parlour was small, lined with bookshelves. Most of the books were romance novels, except for one, a worn edition of The Law of Names and Inheritance. Miss Marple made a mental note of the bookmark placement, Chapter 5, Illegitimacy and the Inheritance of Landed Property. She moved to the writing desk, neatly stacked stationery, an inkwell, no pen. Inside the top drawer, folded carefully, was a legal envelope marked Wills Unfiled. She did not open it, but her hands hovered. The room held other signs of disruption, not forceful, but selective. A photograph frame had been turned to face the wall. A second chair had been pushed slightly back, as if someone had sat there recently, then left abruptly. Miss Marple noted everything without touching a thing. On the way out, her eyes paused on the hat stand. 2 hats, only 1 hatpin. She returned to the cottage just before supper and found Beatrice arranging flowers in the sitting room. "Did you see anyone interesting on your walk?" Beatrice asked. "No one new," Miss Marple replied softly. "But I think I'm beginning to understand what this is not." Beatrice raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "This isn't a story about jealousy, Beatrice," she said. "Or spite. It's not about vanity or flirtation, or even about a woman who asked too many questions." "Then what is it about?" Miss Marple looked toward the window where the last of the light had faded. "It's about a woman who remembered something," she said. "And someone else who couldn't afford to let her say it out loud." Chapter 7. Beneath the Silence. By Thursday morning, the village of Marbledown was back to its usual rhythm, on the surface. The bakery reopened with cautious cheer, the florist arranged lilies in the window with pointed discretion, and the constable made his rounds with a notebook he barely wrote in. Yet the air remained thin and brittle, as though the village itself was bracing for something it couldn't name. Miss Marple had not left the cottage until mid-morning. She had written 2 quiet letters before breakfast and reread one of them twice. She placed both in her reticule and took the long way to the vicarage, pausing near the school gate, the post office, and finally the cemetery, where the earth on Verity Huntley's grave remained undisturbed. Only a small posy had been laid there. Lavender and thyme. No note. She stood a moment in silence, hands folded gently before her. "Flowers without names," she murmured, "and graves without truth." At the vicarage, Reverend Quill had invited Julian Wade for tea, claiming pastoral reasons. Miss Marple had been quietly included. She arrived 10 minutes early, as was her habit. Mr. Wade looked more composed than he had days before, but his posture, the way he gripped his teacup too tightly and stirred without sugar, betrayed a lingering tension. "It's strange," he said, glancing out the window, "how quickly the village resets. One would think nothing had happened." "Villages always reset," Miss Marple replied, "but never in quite the same way." The vicar busied himself with the teapot, while Miss Marple observed Julian Wade carefully. "You were assisting Miss Huntley with legal matters, I understand," she said, in her usual gentle tone. He hesitated. Yes, she had asked about changing her name. She never said why exactly, only that she wanted a clean start. Miss Marple nodded. "And did she mention a man named Moore?" That startled him. "She may have. I can't recall." "She wrote a letter to a Thomas Moore in Chilcombe. He came to see me." Wade's fingers tightened on his cup. "She seemed to be looking for something," Miss Marple continued softly. "Not just clarity, but recognition, someone who would confirm what she already knew or suspected." Julian Wade stood abruptly. "I think I should go. I'm afraid this isn't—" He trailed off. Miss Marple simply folded her hands. "There's one thing I can't quite understand," she said calmly. "If she came to you for a name change, something so significant, why did she also write to someone else for answers? Unless she didn't trust the person helping her." He said nothing. Then, after a long pause, he murmured, "People say they want the truth, Miss Marple. But truth isn't gentle. It rarely arrives without breaking something." He left without another word. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a final walk to Verity's cottage, this time with Constable Hayward, who had come to regard her presence not just as useful, but, in his words, a kind of lantern. The young constable opened the door and stepped back respectfully. Miss Marple walked through each room once more. She said nothing for several minutes. Then she stopped by the writing desk. The inkwell had been moved since her last visit. She pointed. "Did you open this drawer, Jack?" "No, ma'am." She opened it now. Beneath a stack of envelopes tucked beneath a blotter was a folded page, not stationery, diary paper, torn at the edges. The ink was faded, only a portion of the writing remained. He said I should be quiet. That what happened in the summer of '44 wasn't mine to stir again. But how can I be quiet when the child is missing and the only name I have is— The sentence broke off there. Miss Marple turned the paper over. Nothing. She folded it carefully. The child, not just a child lost, but missing, a different kind of wound. That evening, Beatrice Langton lit the sitting room lamp as dusk fell. "You look tired," she said. "I'm thinking about gloves," Miss Marple replied, sipping tea. "Gloves?" "Yes," she said, "or rather, the habit of wearing them. You see, some women wear gloves out of style, others to hide something. Such as—" Miss Marple looked over her spectacles. Scars, burns, or ink on the fingers. The next morning, word spread that the coroner's report had arrived. As expected, Verity Huntley had died from a puncture wound directly to the heart. The weapon had pierced between the ribs cleanly, with precision, no sign of a struggle, no defensive wounds. Miss Marple sat quietly at the cottage window, hands clasped, her face thoughtful. Whoever had killed Verity had done so swiftly, without panic. That narrowed things. The final piece, though, came late in the afternoon. A knock at the door. It was Maggie Pierce, the baker's daughter, eyes wide, clutching something in her apron pocket. I wasn't going to say anything," she stammered. "But I found this in the bin behind the coat tent." She held out a torn scrap of cloth, a glove, or part of one. Burnt at the fingertips, the seam had come undone. A trace of black ink on the inner lining. Miss Marple took it gently. "Thank you, my dear. You've helped more than you know." That night, Miss Marple penned a final letter, then asked Beatrice to deliver messages to the vicar, to Constable Hayward, and to Julian Wade. "All of them?" Beatrice asked. "All," said Miss Marple softly, "and ask them to meet me tomorrow, at Verity Huntley's cottage, 11 sharp." Beatrice hesitated. "You've solved it, then?" Miss Marple didn't smile. "No," she said. "I've simply listened to what the dead woman never said aloud, and to what the living couldn't help but reveal." Chapter 8. The truth behind the pin. The air in Verity Huntley's cottage felt different that morning, not colder, but stilled, as though the walls themselves were listening. The windows were open to let in the faint scent of garden lavender. A kettle hissed gently in the corner, untouched. Miss Marple stood by the writing desk, her posture upright, her face calm. At precisely 11 o'clock, the guests began to arrive. Julian Wade, composed but tense, Mrs. Edna Draycott, dressed in her usual grey but without gloves this time, Constable Hayward, notebook in hand, Beatrice Langton observing quietly from a corner, and finally Reverend Quill, who looked as though he'd stepped into a theatre he'd rather not be part of. They stood uncertainly, no one speaking first. Until Miss Marple did. "Thank you all for coming," she said. "I know this has been a difficult few days, but I believe the time has come to lay the matter of Verity Huntley's death and life to rest." She stepped forward and held up a single item, the torn glove brought to her by Maggie Pierce. "This," she said, "was found in the bin behind the coat tent, burnt fingertips, black ink inside, a rushed attempt to destroy something that had become incriminating." She let the silence hold. But it wasn't only ink it concealed, it covered the fact that someone had recently handled a fountain pen, a particular kind of pen used to forge a signature or edit a legal document. Julian Wade stirred. "Are you accusing—" "I accuse no one, I merely observe," Miss Marple said. "But this glove tells me the killer had ink on their fingers and needed it gone before anyone noticed. Only one person in this room wore gloves that day." She turned. "Isn't that right, Mrs. Draycott?" All eyes shifted. Mrs. Draycott said nothing. Miss Marple's tone softened. "You see, the story begins long before this fate. In the summer of 1944, a young woman gave birth to a child out of wedlock, a girl. The father was an officer. The mother was cast out. The child was hidden. She walked slowly to the side table and picked up the letter Verity had written to Thomas Moore. Verity Huntley grew up never knowing where she came from. But she sensed something. Something wasn't right. Her inheritance? Her name? The silence. That's why she came to Marbledown. And that's why she came to you, Mr. Wade. She wasn't changing her name. She was proving it. Wade's mouth twitched. He said nothing. She discovered what her mother had endured, Miss Marple went on, and she found out there was a witness, a servant named Genevieve Moore, who had later raised a son of her own, Verity wrote to that son, Thomas, and she wrote to the Isle of Wight, hoping someone there would confirm her suspicions. Miss Marple paused. But the letter to the Isle of Wight never reached its destination because G. Moore was already dead. That envelope, however, still found its way into the wrong hands. Someone intercepted it. Someone who had everything to lose if the truth came out. She turned slowly. Mrs. Draycott. The woman's face was pale, unmoving. "I don't believe you killed Verity for spite," Miss Marple said gently. "I think you loved her. Once. You knew her mother. Perhaps more than that. Perhaps she was your sister. Perhaps Verity was your niece. But she represented something unbearable, the truth that was buried, the shame that was locked away." Mrs. Draycott swallowed. Her voice came at last, a whisper. "She would have told everyone." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "she would have. And she would have been believed. She had the documents, the letters, and her will, all prepared, waiting for signature." She turned now to the constable. The coroner noted the precision of the hatpin wound, not a frenzied act. It was swift, clean. The pin belonged not to Verity's own hat, but to a hat from the charity box in the coat tent. And Mrs. Draycott, who helped manage that tent, would have had access to it. She had gloves, she had motive, and she had the silence of an old grief twisted into fear. Mrs. Draycott sat down slowly, her body folding as if the years had suddenly caught up to her. Her voice broke. "She reminded me of everything I tried to bury. My sister died in a home, alone, branded. That child was the last proof that it had happened. I couldn't let her speak." The constable moved gently toward her, unsure. Miss Marple walked to the window. "She didn't want revenge," she said softly. "She wanted to belong. She wanted someone to look at her and say, 'Yes, you were part of us all along.'" Beatrice wept quietly in the corner. Julian Wade stood frozen. The vicar crossed himself, and Mrs. Draycott said, "I'm sorry." Epilogue. A week later, the fate was mentioned only in whispers. Verity Huntley's grave had a new bouquet upon it, this time not anonymous. A small silver plaque had been placed in the soil. Verity, daughter, truth, found. Miss Marple took tea with Beatrice one final time before leaving Marbledown. The flowers bloomed slowly in the window, and a single robin fluttered down to the fence. "Do you ever grow tired of sadness?" Beatrice asked quietly. Miss Marple shook her head. "No, only of people pretending it doesn't matter.